Let's begin with the first story of the day. If you don't subscribe, there's a chance these stories might just come true. It was another mundane Christmas Eve for the McAllister family. Unlike your typical white, snowy Christmas, this one was gray with a severe thunderstorm rolling in just a few hours ago, quickly drenching everything with pouring rain. Gene McAllister had just finished putting his son Blake and his daughter Amy to bed, while his wife was with their newborn Gage, getting him situated into his crib for the night. Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. Gene went to investigate the sudden disturbance, his wife Deborah in tow. Gene pondered over who could possibly be at the door during this time when everyone should be at home with their families and away from this melancholy weather. Before taking a look through the peephole, he revealed an older-looking gentleman with white, disheveled hair and a dirty red coat. Must be a homeless man who thought he could get some extra change during the holidays by dressing as a discount Santa Claus, he thought with disdain before opening the front door. "Can I help you, sir?" Jean greeted politely, trying to hide the annoyance in his voice. "I am a man who is selfless, going around to help the helpless. Though I am a stranger with no relation, I offer you a wonderful vacation," the stranger chimed with a creepy Christmas cheer. At this encounter, a tense awkwardness fell over the room. Deborah stood back a few feet with unease, wondering if the man had just escaped from the psych ward. What began as another boring Christmas Eve of putting the children to bed and laying presents beneath the tree was now turning into a horrifyingly exciting night. And suddenly, neither parent was sure how things were about to play out. "We don't need anything tonight, thank you," Gene responded with a skeptical look as his frustrations grew. He began to close the door, but it was quickly stopped. The old man stood, holding the door open with a menacing grin, his other hand stashed in his coat. "No one these days wants to open their door. Humanity sure has become quite a bore. Have you no manners or sense of civility? I only come here to offer tranquility," the surprised guest uttered, with a stern look growing in his eyes. Fear began to build inside Gene as he was losing control of the situation quickly. "Listen, get the hell off my property, or I'm calling the cops to drag you back to whatever you came from," he shouted, mustering up all the courage he had to get the sick man away from his family. Before he knew it, a hot flash of pain shot across the top of his forehead. He stumbled back confused, feeling for a wound, as he began to see a considerable amount of blood pool on the carpet below him. Fighting wildly to keep his bearings, he looked up to face his adversary, but the next strike to the side of his head would kill him before he would get the chance to see what did it. The murderer stood over Gene's lifeless body, clutching a bloody hatchet in his right hand before turning to a paralyzed Deborah. "Deborah," he said in a few quick steps. He closed the gap between them before slamming the butt end of the handle against her temple. She slumped to the floor unconscious, a gash appearing from where he had struck her. Deborah awoke in her living room with a near-blinding headache. It took only moments for the memories from earlier in the night to come flooding into her head. Looking around, she found that her two children, Blake and Amy, had been set in the living room with her, bound to chairs from the dining room and gagged to keep from screaming. She tried desperately to get up and save her children, only to find she too had met the same fate as them. Upon further inspection of her surroundings, she could see that her husband had been nailed to the wall above the fireplace, his body situated to resemble a crucifix. Oddly enough, during this dramatic rush of emotions, she could swear that she smelled something cooking, almost like someone had left a pot roast or ham in the oven. From the corner of her eye, Deborah saw the twisted intruder come into view. After closer inspection, she could see that the shade and pattern of his red coat and pants suggested that they were not originally that color. His greasy white hair and beard hung down limply around his aged face. The man truly resembled a monster, and his actions reflected the same. The man's face lit up once he saw that she was awake, and he began to chime again in that same eerie voice. I'm sure you're wondering, what is he cooking, and when will it be done? But you should be wondering, what has happened to my infant son? A disgusting realization hit Deborah as she saw one of her kids was not accounted for, and she understood what must be cooking in the oven. She tried her best to hold back her vomit, but the intrusive smell of her beloved son's cinched flesh stuck in her lungs, and she was helpless to stop the impulse. The bile rose up and stopped at the gag fixed into her mouth, burning her throat, choking her, and causing more impulsive heaves as she fought desperately to breathe. The stranger watched in amusement as she choked. Her lungs were burning, and her vision was going dark as her body continued to fight. Her energy was beginning to fade, and she was slipping out of consciousness once again before the gag was ripped from her mouth, and she was able to clear the bile from her throat. She quickly regained focus, completely out of control of the situation. She knew the only chance she had to save her children was to beg. "Please, take whatever you want. Do whatever you want to me. Just please don't hurt my children. Not my babies, please," she croaked between sobs. "Please do not fret or cry. Everyone here is supposed to die. Life is a pain, and society no longer marries. So I am here to relieve the burdens you all carry," the stranger sang, just inches from her face. She could smell his horrible scent of blood and rot now. The children began to slow in their struggles for freedom, and their sobs quieted down as they saw their mother's desperation and realized their fate. Of the two people that were there for them their entire lives and supposed to protect and provide, one was hung lifelessly on the wall, and the other was slowly losing hope and was clearly unfit to get them out of this situation. The stranger stopped and seemed to marvel at his work, a crooked smile stretching across his face. Then, in a sudden twitch, he seemed to move back to work and began to hum Carol of the Bells. He walked out of view and began to grab miscellaneous objects from around the house, laying them out on the coffee table. While a once jolly tune became an ominous omen for the family, Deborah watched as he laid out a bat, a shovel, a knife, a carving fork, a bloody hammer, and a chainsaw. The stranger continued to look around the room, pondering his surroundings before stopping at the fireplace and placing a poker into the fire. Deborah sobbed quietly as she watched, helpless to stop whatever was coming next. Hope was quickly waning from her as she realized she could not help the only people she was supposed to protect. The stranger slowly looked through the different objects before picking up the carving fork and forcing it into Amy's eye. Deborah watched in horror as blood ran down her precious daughter's face. The muffled screaming rang against Deborah's ears like church bells from a sacrilegious ceremony. "Please," she screamed at the intruder, mustering up what little strength she had. "Please just let my children go. They're just kids. They've done nothing wrong. Do whatever you want to me. Just please let my children go." Her words quieted down as she watched the intruder look through his various torture devices. There was no point to her constant begging as she was helplessly watching her family being murdered before her. The intruder stopped at the chainsaw, starting it up with a dramatic roar, silencing the screams of one child as Amy's head was split in two. Blake, only a few feet away, made noises through the gag to suggest he was desperately pleading for his life. It was no use, however, as the intruder made his way to the white-hot fire poker, taking it out of the fireplace, and purposefully strode over to the boy, holding the poker so close to the boy's eye it began to burn. Blake shook and screamed desperately, fighting for his life. The intruder seemed to watch curiously as he fought, before slowly piercing the white-hot poker through his eye until movement ceased in the young boy. Deborah's mind had now disconnected from the gruesome scene, breaking completely as she accepted her fate. The intruder picked up the knife from the coffee table and held it to her throat. Against all human instinct, she simply sat there catatonic as quiet tears ran down her face. Her only reason for living had quickly been taken from her in a series of unthinkable actions, and she no longer saw any point in fighting as she felt the cold steel press against her. The knife was then moved from her throat, and she felt the pressure around her wrists and ankles relieve itself as the knots were cut. A clang sounded through the house as the knife dropped to the floor. Christmas should never be spent alone, and I gifted your family a chance to atone. I must hurry on now, but before I've departed, I would like you to finish what I have started. The intruder chimed, staring at Deborah in anticipation. She had gone cold now, all emotion being replaced with a hopeless pit in her gut as she stared at the knife. Some part of her wanted to pick up the knife and plunge it into the gut of the monster that killed her children. But it was a faraway voice. After all, killing this man would do nothing to bring them back, and all she really wanted was a chance to see her kids again. She would give anything for a late night of changing Gage's diapers or an early morning fussing over Blake and Amy's appearance before school. So as she stared at the welcoming blade, all she saw was a solution to her problems. To maybe watch them grow in whatever afterlife may be waiting for them all, she picked up the blade and did the only thing that made sense in the moment and slid her wrists wide open. She stared blankly as the crimson blood painted her carpet, her very life force escaping away. She felt light and numb as her vision became dark, and had she been capable, a smile might have even crept across her face as she finally got out of the horrific situation. The next morning, the police would find what almost looked like a murder-suicide, where the wife snapped and killed her family before herself. However, after closer inspection, they would find unknown fingerprints on an eerie note. Though this scene may look quite depressing, I promise you there is no need to be stressing. Though this may look like a terrible desecration, the whole family got to indulge on this Christmas vacation. Haunting Sound is the title of today's tale. I earned my MD at Johns Hopkins School of Beginning Medicine with an additional 4 years residency at the Baltimore Methuselah Fellowship. Next came 5 years at the Union Memorial Psychiatry Hospital before I opened a private practice which I've now run for the last 12 years. I have encountered everything from a blind synesthetic who can still see visuals through sound, a schizophrenic who tried to kill herself right in my office, and an obsessive-compulsive who tightened his shoelaces so relentlessly that both feet lost circulation and had to be amputated. I thought I had pretty much seen it all until this latest patient. I will protect his privacy by referring to him as Mr. X. Mr. X's first contact. Mr. X's symptoms were innocent enough, just a ringing in his ears which wouldn't go away. He'd visited numerous otolaryngologists, but as there was no discernible cause for the ringing, he was referred to me to decipher the psychosomatic source of the phenomena. During our first meeting, he didn't make eye contact with me, nor did he ever speak above a whisper. He just stared at his hands, endlessly wringing them against each other. He'd been doing it so obsessively, in fact, that his fingers were rubbed raw and bloody. I made considerable progress on the first day, and with the aid of some anti-anxiety medication, he was able to look me in the eye, although the hand-wringing continued. "Can you hear it, doctor?" he asked me during the second session. "Of course not," I replied. "The sound is not coming from a mutually accessible environment. The sound is a fabrication of your mind." I wish now I hadn't prescribed the anti-anxiety medication, however, that I'd kept those black, lifeless eyes pointed away from me. He pulled his gaze away from the ground and looked at my face, and it seemed as though the effort it cost him resembled how you or I might struggle to gaze at the hideous disfigurement of some elephant man. That's when I began to hear it too, that soft ringing like church bells inside my skull. "How about now? Do you hear it now, doctor?" he asked. And that smile, that twisted grimace of satisfaction, somehow he knew I could. Regardless, admitting I heard his hallucination would only deepen his psychosis, so I naturally had to deny it. I terminated the session early and prescribed some antipsychotics, even taking some for myself. By the time I got home, the ringing was gone. In our third session, the ringing started happening again as soon as he entered the room. The pitch wasn't consistent like it was before, though. It rose and fell with melodic rhythm, like a whole orchestra was welling up inside of me. Mr. X just stared and grinned. I don't think he even cared about getting better anymore. He was just relieved at not being the only one to hear it. He wasn't very responsive that session. All he would do was hum along to the music inside my head. I terminated early again, and he went home without complaint. As he was leaving, my secretary asked me where those strange bells were coming from. I increased the dosage, prescribing some to myself and my secretary as well. The phantom sounds went away again, but the moment Mr. X was back in the room with me, the music would swell up. My racing heart pushed blood through my veins in rhythm with the beat, and my head would throb from the intensity of those notes reverberating around my brain. I started wringing my hands too, just as something to distract myself from the noise. By the end of the fourth session, the skin around my palms was wearing thin, and there was blood beginning to seep through. I hadn't even noticed how hard I was clenching them together. As you might imagine, I referred him to another doctor. He called, no doubt, to complain, but I told my secretary to let it go to voicemail. I didn't care. I wasn't taking him back, and if that were the end of it, then I would have simply hung up my coat and retired that day. But the sound hasn't left me. If anything, it's growing louder, and I had even begun to hear a choir join in with the orchestra. My secretary didn't come into work today. I'm here all alone at wit's end, and what to do. I've tried every cocktail of medication I can think of, but it's only left me feeling worn out and hollow. The sound is still there. I didn't want to be alone here, but somehow my office is the only place I felt safe. I tried to call my secretary to see how she was doing, but I never worked the phone system and must have pushed the wrong button. I just got the voicemail from Mr. X, but I was so desperate for an answer that I still forced myself to listen to it. Here is what he said: "As long as the music plays, you're all right. All the world is a stage, and all of life a play upon it. And as long as the music sounds, the show is still going on. I didn't come to you because I was afraid of the music. I came to you because I was afraid it would stop. I spent the rest of the day calling patients and referring them to new specialists. I called my building manager and opted not to renew the lease on my office. I went home with no intention of ever going to work again. The music is getting quieter every day now, but that's only making me more anxious. I've tried calling Mr. X again, but his cell phone is out of service. I called the doctor I referred Mr. X to, but he never showed up for his appointment. I even went so far as to visit the address listed on his medical forms, but it was just an abandoned theater. I don't know how much longer the music will play for or what will happen when it stops. But until then, I'm just wringing my hands and waiting. If you want to hear the ring, do subscribe.